I am picking up where we left off. This is part 2 of chapter 7, learning how our memory is maintained over time. Sensory memory is brief. Atkinson and Shiffrin's three-part model consists of sensory memory, short-term memory, and long-term memory. Their model emphasizes that memory storage varies in duration and capacity. There's a handy graphic from the book that lays this out. All right, getting back to sensory memory. This is a memory system that very briefly stores sensory information in close to its original sensory form. Sensory memory consists of brief traces on the nervous system that reflect perceptual processes. Visual sensory memory is called iconic memory. Auditory sensory memory is called echoic memory. And a psychologist named Sperling concluded that sensory memory persists for about 1/3 of a second and then progressively fades. Sensory memories enable us to experience the world as a continuous stream rather than in discrete sensations. For example, the way a movie projector plays a series of still pictures. If you stood in the front of the sparkler, you would see the word love spelled by the sparkler because the visual input would be maintained briefly in sensory storage. Working memory is active. Material is passed from sensory memory to short-term memory. More recently, psychologists have come to think of short-term memory as working memory. Definition of short-term memory is a memory storage system that briefly holds a limited amount of information in awareness. Definition for working memory is an active processing system that keeps different types of information available for current use. Information remains in working memory for about 20 to 30 seconds unless you actively prevent it from disappearing by thinking about it or rehearsing the information. Working memory is best thought of in terms of what you're paying attention to and keeping things out of your attention that are not relevant. All right, now we're going to talk about memory span and chunking. Memory span refers to the amount of information that can be held in working memory. Scientist named George Miller noted that a typical limit of 7 items plus or minus 2 in working memory, although more recent evidence suggests that it may be limited to as few as 4 items. Chunking is organizing information into meaningful units to make it easier to remember. For example, if you need to remember a string of letters, you can organize them by something familiar. This makes it easier. The more efficiently you chunk information, the more you can remember. All right, now we're going to talk about long-term memory. This is the relatively permanent storage of information. Long-term memory enables you to remember nursery rhymes from childhood and the meanings and spellings of words that you rarely use and what you had for lunch yesterday. Distinguishing long-term memory from working memory. The distinction between these two has been demonstrated by studies that investigated the serial position effect. The serial position effect is the idea that the ability to recall items from a list depends on the order of presentation, with items presented early or late in the list remembered better than those in the middle. This describes the primacy effect and recency effect. Primacy effect is the better memory for items in the beginning of the list. It reflects long-term memory. The recency effect is better memory for items at the end of a list, and that reflects working memory. What gets into long-term memory? Information is most likely to be transferred from working memory to long-term memory if it is repeatedly retrieved or deeply processed, or helps us adapt to an environment. Evolutionary theory helps explain how we decide in advance what information will be useful. Animals that can use past experiences to increase their chances of survival have a selective advantage over animals that fail to learn from past experiences. Details of familiar objects. Which of these images are correct? You see them all the time, so they should be easy memories to reference according to how memory works. But not so much, right? I'm not real sure which penny is correct or which $10 bill is correct. It is less relevant information, so it is lost. The penny is the only coin with a person facing right, and the $10 bill is the only bill with a person facing left. How is information organized in long-term memory? Long-term storage is based on meaning. Mental representations are stored by meaning. Craik and Lockhart's level of processing model suggests that more deeply an item is encoded, the more meaning it has and the better it is remembered. This requires maintenance rehearsal. This is the repeating of an item over and over. This also requires elaborate rehearsal. Encoding of the information in more meaningful ways makes it easier to remember. The more an item is elaborated at the time of storage, the richer the later memory will be because more connections can serve as retrieval cues. Brain imaging studies have shown that semantic encoding activates more brain regions than shallow encoding, and this greater brain activity is associated with better memory. This graph shows the results of a study of encoding. Participants were asked to consider a list of words according to how the words are printed, in upper or lower case, how they sound, whether they rhyme, or what they mean, whether they fit in a sentence. Later, they were asked to recall the words. Here you can see the three different types, and it showed that the semantic, what the word means, had the best memory. The more deeply the material is processed, the better it is remembered, because they fit the word into a sentence. All right, and that concludes part 2 of Chapter 7, Learning.